There is a small brass key that I carried in my vest pocket for 31 years. It was cold in winter and warm against my chest in summer, and I could find it in the dark without looking. Every month, on the first Monday after the new moon, I would take that key, walk down a lane between two farmhouses, and let myself into a room that no woman in our district was permitted to open on her own. I would light the lantern, I would open a drawer, and I would inspect what was inside item by item, writing each one in a black ledger with a pencil I kept sharpened for that single purpose. The woman whose house it was would stand in the doorway with her hands folded in her apron. She never asked why I checked, not once in all those years. She had been taught that the checking was for her good, and I had been taught the same, and between the two of us that silence held like a stone in a wall. I could feel her eyes on the back of my neck while I worked, and I told myself that what I felt in that room was reverence. It was not reverence. It took me the better part of my life to learn the true name of it, and by then I had done the thing too many times to undo. I am not one of the women who left this world and told you the truth about it. I am one of the men who stayed. I held the rules in my two hands and I enforced them, and I did it well and I was praised for it. Most of what you've heard about this world comes from the women who left, and every word of it is true. But there's another side, the men who were handed the rules and told to enforce them. I was one of those men for 31 years, and the things I held the deepest, the things a man in my position was never permitted to say out loud, I couldn't fit into a video, so I wrote them down. A book called The Weight a Man is Given. The link is in the first comment and the description, and I'll tell you more before the end. For now, stay with me. Let me tell you how a man becomes an inspector, because no one is born into it and no one asks for it out loud. In our world, a minister is not chosen by ambition, he is chosen by the lot. When a new minister is needed, the men who are nominated each take a hymn book from a table, and inside one of those books is a slip of paper, and the man who opens the book with the slip is the one God has chosen. It is meant to remove a man's own will from the matter entirely. I have thought often about that morning. I have thought that if my hand had reached 6 inches to the left, another man would have carried the key down that lane for 31 years, and I would have lived and died an ordinary farmer who never once opened a drawer that was not his own. But my hand did not reach left. It reached the book with the slip in it, and my knees went weak, and the whole congregation turned to look at me, and I understood that my life had just been handed to me sealed, and that I was not permitted to refuse it. When I was ordained, the old bishop took me aside after the service. He put his hand on my shoulder the way you would steady a young horse, and he told me that a minister's duty was not only to preach on Sunday. It was to watch, to walk the district and see that each household kept the ordning, the unwritten rules that governed the width of a hat brim, the color of a buggy, the hour a lamp went dark. And there was one duty, he said, that fell to me alone. Each month I was to inspect the households of the widows and the wives whose husbands were away, and to check that certain things were kept as they should be kept. He did not explain more than that. In our world you did not ask. You received the duty, and you carried it, and the carrying was the answer. He was an old man by then, and his hand shook a little on my shoulder, and I remember thinking that he looked relieved, the way a man looks when he sets down a heavy thing he has held too long. I understand that look now. I did not understand it then. So the first Monday came, and I walked down the lane, and I let myself in, and I learned what the drawer held. It was not what a stranger would guess. It was letters, money set aside in envelopes, a small book where a woman might write her own private thoughts, a bottle of medicine the deacon had not approved, sometimes a photograph which we were forbidden to own of a child or a mother who had passed. These were the things I was sent to find. My duty was to record them, to remove what was not permitted, and to report what I had seen to the bishop, so that he would know the true state of every soul in his care. I want you to understand that I believed in this. That is the part I need you to hear before you decide what kind of man I was. I did not walk down that lane thinking I was cruel. I walked down it thinking I was a shepherd, and that a shepherd who does not count his sheep will lose them in the night. When I took a photograph out of a drawer and wrote it in my ledger, I told myself I was saving a woman from the sin of holding on too tightly to this world. When I took an envelope of money that a wife had hidden from a husband who drank, I told myself I was keeping the order of the household as God ordained it. I had an answer for everything. A man in my position always does. The answers are handed to him along with the key, and they fit so neatly that he never thinks to test them. The first woman I remember clearly was a widow. Her husband had died young, thrown from a wagon, and she lived alone at the end of a long lane with 3 children and a barn that was too big for her to keep. The first month I came, she stood in the doorway and watched me open her drawer, and I saw her jaw tighten when my hand found a folded letter. I read it. It was from her sister, who had left the church years before and lived somewhere out in the English world. The letter said only that she loved her and thought of her and hoped she was warm that winter. By the rule, contact with one who is shunned is forbidden. I wrote the letter in my ledger. I took it with me, and she watched me do it, and she said nothing, and I mistook her silence for agreement. It was not agreement, I know that now. It was the silence of a woman who has learned that speaking changes nothing except the size of the punishment. But at the time I filed her stillness away as proof that the system was gentle, that the women accepted it, that if it were truly cruel, someone would have wept or shouted, and no one ever did. The absence of protest is a comfortable thing to hide behind. I hid behind it for 3 decades. There's a part of this I can't get to here in the few minutes a video gives me, so I wrote it down instead, slowly, without the softening every algorithm asks for. It's the weight a man is given. 10 chapters, each one built around a single thing a man like me carries, an anvil, a black ledger, a lantern at the end of a lane, and what each one really cost the people I love. It's the confession of a man who held the authority and mistook the control for love. The link is in the first comment and the description. That's where the part I couldn't say out loud lives. There was another woman, and I have to tell you about her too, because one story can look like an accident, and 2 stories are the beginning of the truth. She was young, married only a few years, and her husband spent the warm months away working construction with an English crew, sending money home when he remembered to. She kept the farm alone in his absence, and she kept it well, and every month I came and opened her drawer. For a long time there was nothing in it but ordinary things. Then one winter I found a second small book hidden under the paper that lined the drawer, and in it she had been teaching herself to draw. Birds mostly, the barn cat, her own hand. Drawing was not forbidden by any rule I could name, but it was worldly. It was a woman spending her hours on something that fed no one and clothed no one, and I did not know what to do with it. So I did what a man in my position does when he does not know. I reported it. The deacon spoke to her husband. The little book disappeared, and the next month the drawer held only what a drawer was supposed to hold, and she stood in the doorway with a stillness that was harder than the widow's had ever been. I told myself I had corrected something. What I had done was reach into the one small room a woman had made for herself and close the door on it, and call the closing love. I saw her many times after that, at church and at the markets and at the funerals that gather everyone whether they wish to come or not. She was always civil to me. She passed me the bread at the common meal and asked after my wife's health, and her face gave away nothing at all. But she never drew again that I ever heard of, and something in her went quiet that year and stayed quiet, and I was the one who quieted it. A man can do a great deal of damage while being perfectly polite. That is the part the rules never warn you about, because the rules were written by men like me, for men like me, and they were very careful never to describe what the checking did to the far side of the drawer. I need to tell you about the ledger itself, because it became the center of my whole life without my ever deciding to let it. It was bound in black cloth, and it held the accounting of every household I watched. Not money. Souls. A mark beside a name meant something had been found. 3 marks and the bishop would visit. I carried that book everywhere, and over the years it grew heavy, not in weight but in what it knew. I knew which wife hid letters from a shunned brother. I knew which widow kept a photograph of a daughter who had run. I knew which mother saved coins in a jar because her husband could not be trusted with the grocery money. I knew the private griefs of 40 families, and not one of them knew mine. That is the thing no one tells you about holding authority in a closed world. It makes you the loneliest man in the district. I could not confess to anyone because to confess is to show weakness, and a minister who shows weakness loses the lot's authority. I could not ask another man whether he too lay awake wondering if the checking was right, because to ask the question out loud was already a kind of doubt, and doubt was the beginning of the fall, so I carried it alone. I sat at my own kitchen table at night with the lantern low, and I opened the black ledger, and I read the sins of women who trusted me not at all, and I called the reading duty. There is a particular kind of tired that comes from being trusted by no one and feared by everyone, and I wore that tiredness like a second coat for 31 years. Men would fall silent when I entered a barn. Children were told to mind me. Women set their faces to stone when they saw me on the lane, and I told myself this was the respect due a shepherd, when it was only the flinch a creature makes when the hand that feeds it is also the hand that takes. I mistook the flinch for reverence the same way I mistook the checking for love. A man who holds authority in a closed world spends his whole life reading fear and calling it something kinder, because the true reading would cost him more than he is willing to pay. My own wife would come down sometimes and find me there. She would put her hand on the back of my neck and ask if I was coming to bed, and I would say soon, and she would go back up the stairs. She never asked what was in the book. She had a drawer of her own, I understood later. Every woman did. Years after I gave up the duty, when we were both old and the children were gone, I found it while I was looking for something else. a shallow drawer in her sewing table with a false bottom she had made herself, and under it a few letters and a photograph of a brother of hers who had left the church before I ever knew her. She had kept it hidden from me for 40 years. From me. And the thing that broke me was not that she had hidden it. It was that she had been right to. She had lain beside the man who opened drawers, and she had known exactly what he was, and she had built herself a place he would never think to look, in his own house under his own roof. We lay in the same bed for 40 years and never once said the word for what I did. She simply protected herself from it quietly, the way all of them did. Now I have to tell you the month it broke because a story like this must break somewhere, or it is only an excuse dressed up as a confession. It was the widow again, the one at the end of the long lane. Her youngest had grown and gone to be baptized, and she was alone in that big house, and I came on the first Monday as I always did. I lit the lantern, I opened the drawer, and this time there was nothing to find but one thing placed right on top where I could not miss it. It was a letter she had written but not sent. It was addressed to me. I want to be careful here because it was not what a suspicious mind would imagine. It was not affection. It was an accounting of her own. She had written down every month I had come for 11 years. She had written what I took each time. The letter from her sister, the photograph of her mother, the $40 she had saved to fix the barn roof, which I had reported and which the deacon had ruled she did not need. She had written it all in a hand as careful as my own, and at the bottom she had written one line. She wrote, "I never asked why you checked because I knew you did not have an answer that would let you keep coming." And then she had left it in the drawer for me to find, and she had gone to stand in the doorway with her hands folded, and she watched me read my own name. I did not write that letter in my ledger. It is the one thing in 31 years I found and did not record. I put it in my vest pocket next to the brass key, and I closed the drawer, and I told her the inspection was complete, and I walked back up the lane with my heart going like a hammer on cold iron. Because she was right. I had never let myself finish the question. Why do I check? Who was served by the checking? What is the name of the thing I have been calling duty? She had finished the question for me in 11 years of silence, and she had handed me the answer folded in a drawer, and the answer was that I had mistaken control for love so completely that I could no longer tell the two apart. I carried that letter for weeks before I understood it. I would take it out at night after my wife had gone up, and I would read the one line at the bottom again, and each time it took a little more from me. She had not accused me. That was the worst of it. She had simply written down what happened month by month, the way I wrote down what I found in her drawer, and she had held her own black ledger of me for 11 years without my ever knowing it existed. The watcher had been watched the whole time. Every man who checks is himself being checked, and only the woman in the doorway knows the true accounting. I would like to tell you I stopped the next day. I did not. A man does not set down in one morning the thing he has carried for 31 years. But I began to check less. I began to leave the photographs. I began to write fewer marks. And when a younger minister asked me how I kept the household so well ordered, I could not give him the neat answers anymore, because they had come apart in my hands. In the end, I gave up the duty before I gave up the church, and I gave up the church before I understood what I had done, and I am still, even now, giving it up a little more each day. I will not pretend to you that the Ordnung gave me nothing. It gave me a life of order in a world that is mostly chaos. It gave me a community that came to every barn raising and every funeral without being asked. It gave me a faith that I have wounded and rebuilt and wounded again and still somehow hold. But there is no rule handed to a man that requires him to open a grieving woman's drawer and call it shepherding. There is no scripture that makes a photograph of a dead mother into a sin. There is no God I am able to believe in now who ordained that a woman's private griefs should be counted in a black book by a man who never once let her count his. If you were ever the one who held the key, if you were ever handed authority over people who could not refuse you and told that the holding was love, then you already know the weight I am describing. You know how the answers are handed to you so neatly that testing them feels like ingratitude. You know how the loneliness dresses itself up as strength. And if you were ever on the other side of a drawer, standing in a doorway with your hands folded, watching a man take the small things you had hidden to survive, then I am speaking to you most of all, and I am telling you the thing no one told you then. You were not wrong to hide them. He was wrong to look. If you want the rest, the full account from a man still standing inside the thing he's describing, not at the end of it. It's all in The Weight a Man is Given. Links in the first comment and the description. 240 pages of what I was never allowed to set down anywhere else. Open the drawer with me. Until next time, light the fire, but don't forget to speak.